A woman, a teacup, and a silence that has lasted 4 winters. Every afternoon at precisely 4 o'clock, Evelyn Hargrove sits by the same window in a quiet London tea room, waiting for the man who promised to return from the war, for the life she was meant to have. But today, beneath the falling snow, a truth is about to shatter the past she clings to, and nothing will ever be the same again. A love thought lost, a betrayal hidden in plain sight, and a stranger watching from the shadows, with eyes that know pain too well. Tell us, where in the world are you listening from? And what is it about period romances that captures your heart every time? The air smelled of coal smoke and fading roses, a mixture that belonged only to London in winter. Outside, the trees of Russell Square stood stripped bare by the cold, their limbs reaching skyward like the fingers of forgotten widows. Snow fell in whispers, gathering gently on rooftops and the brims of umbrellas, while carriages and automobiles passed slowly through the slush, indifferent to the ache in the heart of the city. Inside Bellamy's tea room, tucked behind fogged glass windows, and the hum of a brass radiator, Evelyn Hargrove sat precisely where she always did. Table 4, by the window, left-hand side. The same time every afternoon, always just after 4 o'clock, as the light turned from silver to ash. She was 39, though the years did not weigh heavily upon her face. They lingered instead in the softness of her gaze, in the careful arrangement of her dark brown hair coiled low at her nape, and in the stillness of her presence. There was something arresting in that stillness, as though time itself paused at her table before moving on. Her wool coat, forest green with a velvet collar, was draped across the chair beside her. She wore a simple day dress in plum, the cuffs of her blouse peeking from under a soft cardigan, and her gloves, dark leather neatly folded, rested beside a small satchel where her sketchbook waited. 2 cups of tea sat before her, one always untouched. She never asked for it aloud anymore, the servers knew. "Miss Hargrove, same as always?" they would say, and she would nod with a faint smile, the kind that disappeared before it could be remembered. The tea steamed gently. Evelyn lifted her own cup with both hands, letting the heat seep into her fingers still stained with ink from a morning of illustration. She stared out the window at the square, but her gaze was not upon the passers-by, nor the snow. It was turned inward, into memory. Arthur Pembroke had first touched her hand in that very park, beneath the copper beech tree near the university wall. He was not beautiful, not like the young men who posed for her classmates, too tall, his features angular and bookish. But his voice had carried a quiet intensity, and when he recited Wordsworth to her, her soul had leaned closer. He had touched her hair once, just behind her ear, as though it were the most sacred thing he had ever known. He had left for the front in the spring of 1916. "Only a year," he had said, his breath fogging in the cold as they stood at Charing Cross Station. "Wait for me, Evelyn. Don't stop sketching. Don't stop believing in the end of this horror." She had waited, through 1 winter, then 2, then 3, and now 4. No obituary, no letter of regret, no body, just silence. Her parents had passed within a year of each other. She had no husband, no children. Her only family now was a brother in Kent, who had not spoken to her since the summer of 1919. She had learned not to expect anyone to write, only Arthur. And even that hope, though starved, refused to die. Behind her, the sounds of the tea room whispered on, the clink of china, the rustle of newspapers, the murmur of conversations too light to touch her. Across the room, a man she had never seen before sat alone, scribbling in a notebook with a frown of concentration. His overcoat looked worn, his shoulders tense, his face marked by something she could not yet name. She turned away. She reached into her satchel and pulled out her sketchbook, turning to a page, already smudged by hesitation. With careful strokes, she began to draw again. Arthur's hands, as she remembered them, long-fingered, and always stained with charcoal from their student days. Hands that once cupped her face as though he were afraid she might vanish. Her pencil hovered, then she set it down. A shadow passed by the window. She glanced up, breath stilling. But it was only a young man in a wool scarf, arm in arm with a laughing girl. Evelyn's heart beat once, slowly. She exhaled. Outside, the snow began to fall more heavily, like a curtain drawn over the past. Inside, Evelyn lifted the second teacup. She did not drink from it. She simply held it for a moment, cradling the heat like a memory, and then set it down again. And so passed another day. No word, no letter, no voice at the door. But still, she returned. Every day. As though the ritual itself might reach him, wherever he was, and call him home. Tomorrow she would sit again at table 4. She would order 2 cups of tea, and she would wait. Not because she believed he would come, but because not waiting would mean admitting he was gone, and Evelyn Hargrove had not yet learned how to stop believing in ghosts. The snow had melted into grey slush along the cobbled paths of Bloomsbury, and the wind that chased between the narrow lanes carried the sharp scent of ink, tobacco, and forgotten paper. It was a Saturday, and Evelyn Hargrove had allowed herself a diversion. A quiet pilgrimage to Caldwell's second-hand bookshop, hidden beneath a crumbling brick archway just beyond Gower Street. The little bell above the door chimed softly as she entered, its tone delicate, almost apologetic, like everything else in her world. The warmth inside was faint, sustained only by a reluctant coal stove in the back corner and the low hum of idle conversation. The shop smelled of must and history, and Evelyn found comfort in it. She wandered the aisles with gloved fingers grazing spines dulled by time. Poetry, natural history, forgotten memoirs, some bindings cracked, some titles faded into near invisibility. Each book seemed like a soul waiting to be touched. She paused in front of a shelf marked Letters and Reminiscences and pulled out a slim volume titled Echoes from a Garden. The author was anonymous. She admired that. There was something noble in remaining unnamed. As she turned a page, the doorbell rang again. Footsteps, light and clipped, crossed the floor behind her. She paid them no mind, until a voice, unmistakable in its haughtily lilting tone, rose in the air like the sharp edge of a blade, masked in silk. "I suppose you've heard about Arthur and Beatrice." Evelyn's hand froze mid-turn. Another voice, equally familiar in its soft condescension, responded with a note of mock surprise. "Of course. Married just last summer, weren't they? In Devon, I believe. Quite the intimate affair, or so I was told. She wore pale blue and carried lilies. Blue lilies." The book slipped from Evelyn's fingers and landed on the floor with a muted thud. She did not pick it up. Through the shelves she glimpsed them. Harriet Anstruther and Mina Vance, 2 women she had once painted beside in the dim classrooms of the Royal College of Art. Their voices, older now but still too brittle with performative grace, spilled into her like poison. "He came back looking thinner," Mina said, "but not broken. No limp, no disfigurement. Thank God." "Beatrice was clever to move quickly," Harriet chuckled, low and smug. "She always had a talent for timing. Poor Evelyn, though. Do you suppose she ever knew?" "No," Mina sighed. "And knowing Evelyn, she probably still waits. She was always delicate." The words hit her with the precision of a scalpel. Delicate. They had never known her, not truly. None of them had. Not Arthur, not Beatrice, not even herself, perhaps. Evelyn turned and walked away before she could hear more, leaving the book on the floor, the words inside unread. Outside, the cold slapped her like truth. The clouds had thickened, muting the city to a ghostly hush. Her steps were quick but not hurried, controlled but trembling beneath the surface. She made no sound as she moved, but inside her heart had begun to crack, not with a clean break, but with the slow agony of something splintering under pressure. She did not return home. She walked instead to Bellamy's tea room, though it was not yet 4 o'clock. She sat at her usual table, her coat still buttoned, her gloves still on. The waitress approached and, as always, asked softly, "The usual, Miss Hargrove?" Evelyn hesitated. Then slowly she nodded. The 2 cups arrived. One she held, the other remained untouched. But today they no longer looked like ritual. Today they mocked her. She stared at the second cup for what felt like an hour, her throat constricted. The tears did not fall. They clung to the rim of her lashes, refusing the dignity of dissent. Her lips trembled just slightly as her fingers traced the edge of the saucer. Beatrice. The name tasted bitter in her mouth. It was not merely betrayal. It was familiarity turned weapon. Beatrice, with her golden hair always perfectly pinned. Beatrice, who had whispered to her during lectures and borrowed her ink pens. Beatrice, who had once pressed a hand to her arm and said, "I would never touch what you love." Arthur had been her secret, her quiet rebellion. And now he belonged to someone else, someone who had lived beside her, studied with her, laughed with her, someone who had known. That knowledge hollowed her out like a cathedral after the choir is gone. She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping the floor in protest. She left a few coins on the table, gathered her coat and satchel, and stepped back into the wind. When she arrived at her flat, the day had turned to dusk. Pale orange bled through the curtains like a wound refusing to close. She dropped her gloves near the door, her coat on the chair, and opened her writing desk with shaking hands. From a drawer, she pulled out a sheet of fine ivory paper and an old envelope bearing the Kent address of Charles Hargrove, her older brother. They had not spoken in nearly 3 years. He had never forgiven her for refusing the proposal of the man he had chosen for her. She had never forgiven him for speaking at their father's funeral as if her silence had been absence. But tonight, she could not bear to carry her heartbreak alone. Her hand hovered above the page, pen poised. "Dear Charles, I know we have—" She stopped. She could not write of Arthur. Not now. Not like this. Instead, she drew lines across the paper, slowly, deliberately, until the page was no longer a letter but a field of broken ink. Then she tore it in half, then into quarters, then into dust. The pieces fluttered into the wastebasket like dead leaves. That night, she did not sketch. She did not eat. She sat by the window as the darkness climbed the walls. Her reflection stared back, paler than usual, mouth pressed tight, eyes wide but dry. She wondered whether Beatrice had ever waited, whether she had watched the post for letters that never came, whether Arthur had kissed her the same way, gently at first, then with a hunger barely restrained. Had he whispered the same verses? Had he made the same promises? The ache that bloomed in Evelyn's chest was not jealousy, it was erasure. She had waited for a ghost. Beatrice had married the man, and Evelyn had become a woman no one remembered. She closed the curtain. She turned out the lamp, but she did not sleep. She sat in the darkness and whispered his name once, just once, and then she let it go. Or at least, she tried. The days had grown shorter, and the cold sharpened its grip on the city like a vice that would not release. London existed in shades of slate and coal, its skies heavy with a silence that seemed to echo Evelyn's own. Snow no longer fell. It had become something else entirely, something more permanent. A frost that crusted the edges of windows, of thoughts, of hearts. The tea room had become her only refuge, a place where she could exist without explanation, where her pain could be poured quietly into porcelain cups and sweetened by ritual. She returned to it every afternoon as though it were a chapel, and in its warmth she tried to believe she had not lost everything. But it was there, in that very room, that something unexpected began. He first appeared on a Wednesday. It was the kind of afternoon that pressed against the bones, raw and wind-bitten. Evelyn had settled into her usual seat at precisely 4 o'clock. Her gloves rested neatly on the windowsill, her sketchbook unopened before her, her tea untouched. The waitress, familiar now, gave her a nod tinged with the weight of routine and delivered 2 cups. And then Evelyn saw him. He had chosen the table in the corner, the darkest, most secluded one, near the coat stand and beneath the oil painting of the moors that had faded to near obscurity. He was tall, even seated, with a worn overcoat of dark navy that still carried the cold upon its shoulders. A wool scarf clung to his neck, as though reluctant to let go of warmth. He wore a felt hat, wide-brimmed, which he removed slowly. revealing hair streaked with premature grey. But it was not his face that held Evelyn's attention. It was his stillness. There was something in the way he sat, one leg stretched slightly forward, the other drawn back as if favouring it. His hand trembled faintly as he reached for the spoon beside his cup, and his eyes, hazel, deep and unreadable, lowered not in shyness, but in heaviness. He removed a small notebook from his coat, leather-bound, frayed at the edges. A fountain pen followed, and he began to write. It was not the confident scribbling of a man lost in thought. It was measured, tentative. His hand paused more often than it moved, as if he were searching not for the right word, but for the permission to write it. Evelyn watched him only in brief glances at first. She had no desire to intrude, but as the minutes slipped past and her own tea grew cold, she found herself sketching. Without intention, her pencil moved. Soft lines, curved shoulders, downturned head, the tension in his posture, the way the light touched his temple and then fell away. She sketched his solitude because she recognized it. He came again 2 days later, at the same hour, same corner, and again after that. No words passed between them. For 7 days, 7 silent, precise afternoons, they shared that space. Evelyn in her window seat with 2 cups, and the stranger in the corner with his quiet ache. Sometimes he wrote, sometimes he merely stared at the paper. Often his fingers curled around the pen with such force that Evelyn wondered if it hurt him to hold it. On the 8th day, the quiet broke. It was raining. Thin grey rain that drew streaks along the windows like tears a child was too proud to cry. Evelyn had left her umbrella behind in a moment of carelessness. Her hair was damp at the edges, her cheeks flushed with cold. She slid into her seat, removing her gloves slowly, when she realized the man in the corner had risen, and he was walking toward her. She looked up. He did not smile. His face was solemn, but not unfriendly. He reached her table and stood beside it, his hat in one hand, notebook in the other. "I apologize," he said, his voice quiet, refined. "May I sit?" She gestured to the chair across from her, not the one with the untouched cup, the other. He lowered himself carefully, wincing almost imperceptibly as his left leg bent. Then he placed the notebook on the table and said, "You sketch." Evelyn felt her breath catch. "Yes," she replied. "And you write?" He gave a faint, rueful nod. "I used to. Now, I mostly pretend." She tilted her head slightly. "Are you a novelist?" "No," he said. "I was a poet." The pause between his words told her everything she needed to know. She did not press him. Instead, she offered the smallest smile. "And now?" He looked down at the notebook. His fingers tapped it once, twice. "Now, I'm waiting for the words to come back." The silence that followed was not awkward. It was reverent. "I'm Evelyn," she said at last. "Thomas Bellamy," he replied. The name settled between them like the scent of ink on old paper, familiar yet untouched. Their conversation did not stretch beyond that. He thanked her. She nodded, and he returned to his corner. But something had shifted. That evening after dinner, Evelyn bundled herself in her coat and walked, not home, but to the square. The gas lamps had already been lit, casting soft pools of amber light upon the pavement. The fog had begun to settle low, curling around the iron fences like a secret. She saw him again, not in the tea room, but seated on a bench beneath the lamplight, notebook open upon his knee. His pen hovered, then touched the page. He wrote for several minutes, then stopped. He read what he had written. A moment later, with a sharp breath and a clenched jaw, he tore the page from the notebook, crumpled it in his fist, and let it fall to the wet cobblestones. He sat back, closed his eyes, tilted his head to the heavens, as though hoping the words he had lost might fall like rain and find him again. Evelyn watched from across the square, partially hidden beneath the overhang of a shuttered storefront. Her breath misted before her. Her hand reached for her satchel. She began to draw him again, not as he had looked in the tea room, but as he looked now, broken open, exposed, beautiful in his disappointment. There was no pleasure in watching him suffer, only recognition. The difference between them was paper thin. He had lost words, she had lost presence, And in this city full of noise and movement and people who moved on too quickly, they had found each other through silence. She did not speak to him again that night, but in her sketch she left space beside him, as if one day she might sit there too. The gallery stood modestly on a narrow street off Fitzroy Square, its facade unassuming, its windows dimmed by the condensation of bodies and conversation within. The air was brisk that evening, the wind biting at faces with merciless delight, and yet the city's cultured class had gathered nonetheless. Art critics wrapped in wool and silk, patrons smelling of lavender water and old money, and painters in their signature black with stained fingers and distracted eyes. Evelyn arrived precisely at 6. She had received the invitation a week prior from a former colleague, a quiet man named Irving Holloway, who had always looked at her sketches with the reverence one reserves for scripture. He was exhibiting for the first time since the armistice, and it had touched her, his persistence, his courage. She had not come to be seen. She had come to witness his resurrection. Her coat was a deep wine velvet with a fur collar, borrowed from a wealthier friend who had grown tired of it. Beneath, she wore a dove-grey dress with a high neckline and mother-of-pearl buttons that ran like a fragile thread down her spine. Her gloves were pale cream, her shoes polished but worn at the edges. She had pinned a simple brooch, silver, in the shape of a fern, just above her heart. Not for elegance, but for protection. The moment she stepped through the threshold, heat and conversation enveloped her. Light flickered from gas lamps and candelabras, dancing over the canvas-lined walls. Wine was being poured into crystal, laughter spilling in lilting waves, and the floorboards creaked beneath the weight of tailored shoes and history. For a time, Evelyn allowed herself to drift. She examined paintings with thoughtful eyes, nodding when appropriate, exchanging soft pleasantries with familiar faces from another life. She spoke little, smiled less, but there was a calm in her stillness, as though she had woven a shell around herself and lined it with silence, until she heard the voice. "Oh, darling, it's been too long. You haven't aged a day." It was a voice that once recited poems over shared baths and whispered secrets into the dark of their shared dormitory. A voice that had promised never to betray. Evelyn turned slowly. There she was, Beatrice Wren, brighter than she had ever been. Her coat was of emerald wool trimmed in fox fur, her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon beneath a cloche hat, adorned with a cluster of ivory feathers. She wore satin gloves and diamonds that sparkled like ice. Her cheeks were flushed from wine and praise. "Evelyn!" Beatrice exclaimed, her smile radiant, her eyes scanning her as though searching for damage. "You look, well, still favoring grey, I see, always so classic." Evelyn's heart did not race. It sank, deep and steady, as though into the ocean floor. "Beatrice," she said, her voice as even as stone. "It's been a long time." Beatrice leaned in as though to kiss her cheek, but Evelyn turned slightly, and the gesture landed in the air between them. There was a moment, just a breath, where the past surged up like a wave. Then Beatrice laughed, brushing it away with elegance. "Can you believe it? Arthur and I married in June, in Devon. Very small, very quiet. He's thriving, you know. He lectures sometimes at the university now, still writing, always writing. I do think marriage has settled him." Her words flowed too smoothly, like water from a pitcher held by a trembling hand. Evelyn said nothing. Her fingers tightened slightly around her gloves. Beatrice continued, too brightly. "I've taken up hosting a salon on Thursdays. You must come one evening. The war changed us all, didn't it? But we must keep moving forward. What's the use in clinging to ghosts, That final sentence, delivered with the gentleness of a knife, landed like cold steel against Evelyn's ribs. She did not flinch. She smiled, a small, perfect smile, and replied, "Some ghosts never asked to be buried." Beatrice faltered. For a brief, delicious instant, her facade cracked. Then she recovered, adjusting the collar of her coat with a flick of her gloved hand. "I must go greet someone," she said lightly. "But do visit soon. Truly, I've missed your quiet wisdom." Evelyn watched her glide across the room, wrapped in silk and lies. She remained only long enough to thank Irving Holloway, her voice steady, but her chest hollow. Then she stepped out into the snow-dusted street and walked until her feet ached, until the noise of the gallery faded behind her like a fading refrain. The city had quieted. A thin sheet of white coated the ground, blurring edges, silencing footsteps. Lanterns glowed softly behind lace curtains. A stray dog pawed through bins near the grocer. Evelyn walked without direction, the cold seeping into her bones like ink into paper. Near Tavistock Square she saw him, Thomas Bellamy, leaning against a wrought-iron fence, his coat turned up against the cold, a cigarette burning low between his fingers. His notebook was tucked under his arm. He did not move as she approached, but his eyes, those solemn, thoughtful eyes, met hers. She stopped before him. For a moment, they said nothing. Then she spoke, her voice raw, stripped of poise. "I saw her tonight. Beatrice." He nodded once. "She was always the sun, but I didn't realize how cold it felt to stand in her shadow." Thomas said nothing. He merely watched her. "She married him," Evelyn continued, the words falling like stones. "Arthur. They've built a life. A comfortable, curated life. And her breath caught. "I've been waiting for a ghost." He dropped the cigarette into the snow and crushed it beneath his boot. "You've been waiting for truth," he said quietly. "That's different." She turned away, hugging her coat tighter around her. "I should be angry," she whispered, "but all I feel is small." Thomas stepped closer, not enough to touch, just enough to share her silence. They walked, slowly, without direction, without pretense. They moved through Bloomsbury like two memories finding shape. The city muffled around them, a gas lamp flickered, a carriage clattered distantly down the lane. Neither reached for the other, and yet the closeness between them pulsed with something unspoken. She asked him nothing. He offered no answers. It was enough for that night to walk side by side, to share the snow, the silence, the ache. And as they passed the quiet buildings and shuttered shops, Evelyn realized she had spoken more to this man in one evening than she had to anyone in years. Not because she trusted him, but because he did not ask her to explain. He simply listened. And in that listening she felt, if only for a moment, seen. The city had begun to thaw. It was not spring, not yet, but the frost no longer clung so desperately to the window panes, and the days, though still pale, stretched a fraction longer before fading. The streets of Bloomsbury remained grey and damp, and the scent of coal smoke lingered like a habit, but there was a soft shift in the air, like a held breath beginning to exhale. In the corner of Bellamy's tea room, Evelyn Hargrove sat with her sketchbook open, a pencil poised lightly between her fingers. The paper before her was nearly blank save for a delicate line, just the curve of a shoulder, the faintest suggestion of a face. She was not drawing to finish. She was drawing to remember, or perhaps to remain. Across the room, Thomas Bellamy had settled into what had become his habitual place, the table near the fireplace, where the warmth reached just enough to soothe his joints. He was dressed in his usual wool coat, the edges slightly frayed, and a scarf of faded navy that matched the shadows beneath his eyes. His hair, unruly at the edges, caught the amber light and revealed more silver than before. Their routines had merged, slowly and without discussion. They arrived at the tea room at nearly the same hour each day. They did not always sit together, but the space between them had grown narrower, as though the silence had learned to carry their words. It was on that Thursday that he first handed her a page, folded carefully, tucked beneath the saucer of his untouched second cup. Evelyn saw it when she moved to sit with him, her sketchbook cradled in one arm, and he nodded toward it as if it were no more than a receipt. She unfolded it slowly, a poem or something like one. It had no title, no structure, just 5 lines, each hesitant and raw. I watched the snow fall through glass and felt nothing until she looked up. Her silence louder than the fire, her breath more honest than the tea. I remembered how to listen. She read it once, then again. When she finally looked up, he was watching her, not with pride, but with dread, as though he expected her to laugh or dismiss it. Instead, she placed the paper gently upon the table as one would a fragile relic, and whispered, "Why did you stop?" He looked away. "I didn't stop," he said. "The war did. The world did. Words no longer sound the same when you've heard men scream." She did not answer. She merely reached into her satchel and pulled out her sketchbook. She turned it toward him. There, across 2 pages, was a drawing of him. Not a portrait, not truly. It was his form bent over a notebook beneath a gas lamp, the city blurred behind him, his expression etched in charcoal shadow. He was not heroic in it. He was real. Thomas blinked. Once. Twice. Then he said, "I didn't know I looked like that." "You don't," she said softly. "Not always." They sat in silence for a long while. The waitress brought their tea, and the cups steamed between them like the beginning of a spell. Outside, rain tapped gently at the windows, polite in its persistence. That night, Evelyn returned home to find a letter waiting. Heavy cream paper, sealed with the emblem of Langley House Publishing. She opened it slowly. A formal invitation. The publisher was assembling a collection of post-war poetry from emerging voices, and had requested her hand to illustrate it. 10 plates, ink and graphite, to be completed within 2 months. The final line made her freeze. The editor behind the project was Arthur Pembroke. She stood very still in the center of her sitting room, the letter trembling in her hands. He had not written to her directly. The letter was professional, distant, but unmistakably his doing. He had chosen her. For what purpose, she could not guess. Was it guilt, nostalgia, an attempt at contrition, master's collaboration? She did not know. She did not sleep. The next day, she brought the letter to the tea room. Thomas noticed the tension in her hands before she spoke. She passed the envelope to him without a word. He read it slowly, then looked up. "You're going to decline?" he said. Evelyn hesitated. "I should." "Why?" Her eyes searched his. "Because it's him. Because I'll be reduced to lines on a page again. Because it feels like walking into a room where I've already been humiliated." Thomas nodded. Then, with gentleness, "But aren't you tired of letting him take things from you?" She did not speak. He leaned closer, his voice low and unwavering. "You are not a shadow. You are not waiting in corners anymore. If you illustrate those poems, do it because you chose to. Not because he asked. Not because you owe him. But because the world deserves to see what you've been too afraid to show." She blinked, and something long dormant, stirred in her chest. That evening, she accepted the commission. She returned to her studio, dusted off her inkwells, and prepared the thickest parchment she could afford. She opened her window slightly to feel the cold air as she worked, to let it cleanse the room of the ghosts that lingered. She began to draw again, not for Arthur, but for herself. For the girl who once dreamed in charcoal and twilight, for the woman who was learning how to breathe without apology. Several days later, she arrived early at the tea room. Thomas was already there, seated with his notebook. He rose slightly when he saw her, then sat as she approached. They spoke little that day, but as she reached for her teacup, she noticed a scrap of paper near his saucer, torn from a different notebook, scribbled in haste. She picked it up without asking. It was a single line. "She waits like winter, quiet and unyielding." Her breath caught. She folded the paper carefully, then slipped it into the pocket of her coat. She would not speak of it. Not yet. But she would keep it, because in that line she heard herself not as forgotten, but as seen, and perhaps, at last, understood. The lamps of Mayfair burned low that evening, their golden halos flickering against the velvet curtain of night. London had dressed itself in quiet opulence, as though the war had never touched its facades. Carriages moved past townhouses, where laughter spilled through lace-draped windows, and the city's well-heeled emerged in silks and furs, their perfumes trailing behind them like echoes of an old world refusing to die. Evelyn stood at the threshold of number 11, Grosvenor Place, a grand Georgian residence that now served as the headquarters for Langley House Publishing. The invitation had arrived on thick paper, engraved with silver letters and the faintest trace of lavender. It was an exclusive affair, a salon to celebrate the forthcoming volume Verses After the Silence, and to showcase both the poets and the artist chosen to illustrate them. Her. She had arrived alone, She wore midnight blue, simple, floor-length, unadorned, save for a silver belt that clasped at her waist like a whisper. Her coat, charcoal wool with velvet trim, hugged her shoulders tightly as she stepped into the entryway. A footman took it without looking her in the eye. She moved forward into the light. The drawing room had been transformed. Velvet settees lined the perimeter, candelabras glittered on sideboards, and crystal goblets shimmered in soft light. Voices rose and fell in hushed harmony, and everywhere there was the clink of glass, the rustle of silk, the scrape of polished shoes on parquet. Evelyn inhaled deeply and entered. Eyes turned, but only briefly. She was neither grand nor flamboyant, and in a room full of wives, patrons, publishers, and posturing poets, she was quiet elegance, seen if only in glimpses. That was how she preferred it. Until tonight. Tonight, she would not wait in corners. She moved through the crowd with grace, nodding at acquaintances, accepting flutes of champagne she did not sip. Several guests commented on her illustrations for the upcoming collection. She responded with soft gratitude, her gaze scanning for only one face. She found it near the fireplace. Arthur. His back was to her at first. He was speaking to a trio of editors, gesturing lightly with his glass. His voice, even at a distance, had not changed. Still polished, still practiced. His hair was thinner now, parted carefully. His shoulders had rounded. And yet, he stood with the same quiet confidence, as if the world were still arranged for his comfort. He turned and saw her. For a long second, he did not move. His eyes widened, then dropped, then lifted again, and Evelyn felt it, the ripple of memory, of recognition, of something unsaid pressing between them like breath held too long. He crossed the room. She stood still. "Evelyn," he said softly, carefully, as if testing the name. "I wasn't certain you would come." "I was invited," she answered. He smiled faintly. "Of course." There was silence. "I read your sketches," he offered. "They're extraordinary." "Thank you." Another pause. The weight of it was unbearable and exquisite. "I didn't know how to write to you," he continued, "after everything." Evelyn tilted her head. "You mean after marrying Beatrice?" His lips parted, but no words followed. "I thought," he said at last, "that you had moved on." Her answer came with the clarity of a blade. "I waited," she said. "You didn't." He flinched, not dramatically but deeply, as if her words had pierced something he had long buried. "I'm sorry," he murmured. But she was no longer listening, because in that instant Beatrice entered the room. Late, radiant, as always. Her gown was emerald silk, cut daringly low, with a string of pearls that danced at her collarbone. She stepped into the salon as though it belonged to her, and perhaps it did. Her eyes scanned the room. They found Arthur, then Evelyn. Her smile faltered. Beatrice approached. "Evelyn," she said, voice laced with surprise and tension. "I didn't know you were attending." "I'm the illustrator," Evelyn replied. "My name is on the invitation." Beatrice laughed too quickly. "Of course. I suppose I just didn't expect to see you here." Her hand touched Arthur's arm, a small, possessive gesture. Evelyn watched it without blinking. Silence fell between the three of them, the kind of silence that is not empty, but so full it threatens to collapse. Other guests slowed their conversations, ears tuning toward the magnetic stillness. Arthur's gaze moved from Beatrice to Evelyn, and in that gaze Evelyn saw it all. Regret, confusion, longing, but not love, not anymore. She drew in a breath and exhaled slowly. Then, without drama, without flourish, she stepped back. "I won't stay long," she said quietly. "I've already seen what I needed to." And she turned, not toward the refreshments, not toward the door, but through the center of the room, her posture straight, her head held high. Her silence louder than anything she could have said. She did not look back. The whispers began, before the door had closed behind her. Outside, the air was cold and clean. She wrapped her coat tightly around her and walked briskly down the street, her footsteps echoing softly against the stone. A light snow had begun to fall again, dusting the pavement with a delicate veil. By the time she reached her flat, her hands were trembling, not from cold, but from the aftermath of restraint. She lit a lamp, removed her gloves, unfastened the belt at her waist. Then she crossed to her desk, pulled out her sketchbook, and opened to a new page. She did not draw Arthur, or Beatrice, or any half-finished memory. She drew a woman, not young, not grand, but standing alone at the center of a crowded room, her eyes steady, her spine unbent. A woman no longer waiting. She titled it simply, A Room of Her Own. The rain came as a hush that morning, soft and steady, veiling the rooftops of Bloomsbury in a translucent curtain. It dripped from wrought-iron balconies and pooled in the cobblestone gutters like melted grief. Evelyn watched it from her window, her sketchbook untouched on the table beside her. A fire crackled gently behind her, the scent of coal and paper mingling in the still air. She sipped her tea slowly, knowing the day would require more than warmth. It would require something she was no longer certain she possessed, courage wrapped in elegance. An invitation had arrived the week prior from Langley House, an intimate salon, smaller than the grand affair at Grosvenor Place. Fewer guests, fewer theatrics, but more scrutiny. This gathering, the note explained, would host a handful of critics, patrons, and select contributors. Her presence was expected. She had agreed. And this time, she would not go alone. Thomas had not immediately said yes. When she asked, delicately over tea, he had looked down at his hands before answering. "If you wish," he said, his voice steady but guarded. "But I don't belong in those circles anymore." She had only smiled and reached for her gloves. Now, as they walked together beneath her umbrella, the air was thick with damp anticipation. Thomas wore his best coat, the dark wool pressed and brushed, though the lining had faded. His cravat was plain, his shoes carefully polished, and his hair combed back with the discipline of someone stepping into hostile territory. Evelyn noticed his limp was more pronounced today, but he said nothing of it. They arrived at the townhouse on Bedford Square, a dignified home with pale stone steps and tall windows glowing warmly. Inside, laughter greeted them like perfume. Too sweet, too rehearsed. Evelyn removed her coat and stepped aside, as Thomas did the same, handing both garments to a maid with a gracious nod. He straightened the collar of his vest, adjusted the cuff of his shirt. It was a small gesture, but it told her everything. They entered the parlor. Voices fell briefly, just briefly, then resumed, as if by cue. Langley himself greeted her first, his mustache impeccably waxed, his gaze flicking to Thomas and away with the practiced discretion of an old-world gentleman. "Miss Hargrove," he said, "so pleased you could join us." "Thank you," Evelyn replied, her hand still lightly resting on Thomas's arm. "May I introduce Mr. Thomas Bellamy?" Langley extended his hand with the exact amount of politeness required. "Of course, a pleasure." Thomas met it firmly, then stepped back, eyes calm but distant. They moved further into the room, weaving through pockets of conversation and candlelight. Evelyn could feel the eyes on them. No stares, just glances. Measured, calculating. The room was populated by men with ink-stained fingers and women with gemmed pins at their throats. A baritone voice recited Wilde near the fireplace. A group of women discussed the decline of Parisian salons since the war. A publisher's wife wore a gown too young for her, and the scent of jasmine followed her like smoke. Evelyn felt the shift in air as soon as she introduced Thomas again. To the critic from the Observer, a cool nod. To the patroness from Kensington, a smile so thin it nearly vanished. And then to Beatrice's cousin, Leonora, whose lips curled at the edges like an unopened letter. "How delightful," Leonora said. "A poet. And what do you do now, Mr. Bellamy?" "I write freelance," Thomas answered evenly, "and sell rare books when I can find them." "Ah," Leonora replied, her smile fixed. "So, a man of many small talents." Evelyn's fingers clenched around her glass. Thomas only inclined his head. The conversation shifted mercifully, but the sting remained. Evelyn excused herself after a few moments, pretending to admire a landscape sketch on the wall. Thomas followed. They stood side by side in a narrow alcove, the sounds of the salon muted by thick drapes. "I told you," he said quietly, "that I didn't belong here." Evelyn turned to him, her voice low. "They don't know you. They don't need to," he replied. "They've already decided. There was something brittle in his tone. Not bitterness, not pride, something older, something broken. I used to be like them, he continued, before the war, before the mud and the noise and the letters that never got sent. I was the eldest son of a Devonshire estate, groomed to inherit, to lead, to marry a girl with the right name and the right lineage. Evelyn said nothing. I enlisted the day after my father forbade me to, Thomas said. He wrote me once, told me I had disgraced the name, told me not to come back. A silence passed between them, heavy and reverent. Do you ever hear from him? She asked. He shook his head. He died before I returned. I'm sorry. He smiled faintly. Don't be. He would have died eventually. I simply made the timing inconvenient. There was a pause. Then he added, I don't tell you this so you'll pity me, Evelyn. I know. I tell you because I see it. In their eyes. And in yours. That made her flinch. In mine? Yes, he said. You look at me as if I've survived something you're not sure how to touch. She turned her face away. I brought you here because I thought, I know why you brought me, he interrupted. And I came because I wanted to see what it cost you. They did not speak again until they reached the street. The rain had returned. The umbrella did little to shield the silence between them. They reached her doorstep. The lamp above her stoop flickered in the wind. Thank you for coming, she said, her voice barely audible. He removed his hat. Thank you for asking. She hesitated, then slowly reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded letter. It was addressed in her hand, but worn, the corners soft from time. She stared at it for a moment. It's for my brother, she said. I wrote it a week ago. I was going to send it. Thomas nodded. She stepped inside. The door closed softly behind her. Later that night, she lit the fire and sat by the hearth with the letter in her lap. She read it once more, then tore it, once, then again and again, until it was nothing but paper without words. She fed the pieces to the flame. They curled, blackened, vanished, and still she waited for the heat to reach her. But it never did. The wind struck London that night like a jealous lover. It howled down alleyways, shook the shutters of the terraced houses, and flung the rain against rooftops in furious sheets. Trees bent low as if in prayer, and even the gas lamps flickered, their flames cowed by the fury of the storm. Inside her flat on Ridgemount Street, Evelyn lay curled beneath her blanket, her breath shallow, her cheeks flushed with fever. She had not left the warmth of her bed in nearly 2 days. The small fire in the hearth burned low, its embers glowing faintly like the pulse of a tired heart. Her teacup sat untouched on the bedside table. Her sketchbook lay closed beside her pillow, its leather cover cool and damp from the cold seeping in through the glass. It had begun with a chill, simple, familiar, unremarkable, but London in March was cruel, and Evelyn, drained from weeks of emotional strain and exposure, had not fought it off in time. Now her limbs ached, her throat burned, and her thoughts moved through fog. Still she had refused to send for anyone. She hated weakness, hated needing, and most of all, hated being seen in the moments when her dignity had slipped. So she stayed silent. But silence has its limits. Outside, beneath the iron railing of her building, Thomas Bellamy stood soaked through to his collar. He had come at dusk, unsettled by her absence from the tea room, then again from the fact that she had missed their walk the evening before. He had knocked once, waited, knocked again. No answer. And yet no sound of travel, no light in the window, no sign that she had gone anywhere at all. Now he stood in the sleet, his coat drenched, the brim of his hat dripping steadily, his gloves stiff with cold. The wind bit through the seams of his boots, the ache in his leg pulsing like a warning. But he would not leave. He watched her window with unwavering focus, as if sheer will might summon her silhouette behind the lace curtain. He had never knocked more than twice. She valued her solitude. He respected it. But now, as the rain pelted him mercilessly, he held something in his hand, a small envelope sealed in wax. Ink had begun to blur on the edges. He glanced at the door again. Then slowly, he bent, slid the envelope beneath the gap, and stepped back. One more look at the window. Still nothing. He closed his eyes against the sting of wind and waited. An hour passed, then another. By the time the light in Evelyn's bedroom flickered to life, dim, hesitant, like a candle waking from sleep, Thomas was no longer at the door. She had awoken in a fevered daze, unsure of the time, her limbs trembling as she pulled herself upright. The room spun slightly. Her breath caught in her chest. She pressed a hand to her temple, then reached for the glass of water beside her. That was when she noticed it. A single sheet of paper beneath her door. No name, just her initials on the front. She stared at it for several long seconds before moving. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. The wax had smeared, the paper cold from the storm. Carefully, she broke the seal. Inside there was no title, only a poem. She walks like rain in quiet cities, seen, but never stopped. She speaks in sketches and silences, in glances that rewrite history. I waited once, for someone to understand how it feels to be a shadow and not mind the dark. Then she looked at me, and I was no longer waiting. Evelyn read the lines, slowly, then again, and again. The words were simple, gentle, but they opened something inside her with devastating grace, not because he had written about her, but because he had written at all. She held the page to her chest and wept, not from sorrow, nor from fever, but from the aching relief of being seen, truly seen. Not as muse, not as memory, not as a woman to be pitied or possessed, but as herself. She rose slowly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, her movements weak but certain. She lit the lamp at her writing desk, the soft glow spreading across the room like hope returning. She opened her sketchbook, turned to a clean page, and began to draw, not as distraction, not as ritual, but as offering. She drew Thomas, not as she knew him now, but as he had once been, seated alone in the corner of the tea room, long before they spoke, before words bridged the space between them. She drew his profile turned toward the window, the light soft on his face. His hand paused over his notebook, the pen still, his eyes lost in thought. She drew the sorrow that lived at the edges of his mouth, the strength he wore like armor beneath his coat, the loneliness he had not yet dared to name. When it was finished, she wrote a single sentence beneath the portrait, in ink the color of storm-washed skies. He waited too, and for the first time in weeks, she slept deeply, dreamlessly, as the storm passed through the city and left behind only stillness. The wind had quieted by the time Evelyn stepped out onto Ridgemount Street that afternoon. The city, still clad in winter's last breath, wore a softness around its edges, fog curling low over rooftops, bare trees swaying with weary grace, carriages moving slowly through puddled cobblestones. The sky hung heavy with that strange pale light only late March could carry, somewhere between farewell and promise. Evelyn's gloved fingers closed gently around the brass handle of the tea room's door. Bellamy's had not changed, not in the ways that mattered. The familiar scent of cinnamon, bergamot, and polished wood greeted her like a memory too proud to ask for affection. The clatter of porcelain, the soft murmur of voices over linen-draped tables, these sounds had once filled the silence in her heart. Today, she did not come to be filled. Today, she came to end something. She moved with quiet certainty through the narrow passage between tables, her coat a deep moss green, her hat modest, her presence deliberate. Her usual table, table 4 by the window, was occupied by a mother and daughter sharing sponge cake. She did not mind. She chose a seat near the back, away from habit, away from ghosts. Her gloves came off one finger at a time. She folded them neatly beside her cup and stared at the steam as it rose, elegant, temporary. A fragment of her own voice echoed in her mind. I waited. You didn't. She had not seen Arthur since the salon, but he lived nearby. She knew that much. And still, she had not prepared herself to see him again. Yet when her eyes lifted toward the front window, there he was, Arthur Pembroke. He sat at the table she had once claimed, his back slightly hunched as he stirred his tea. Beside him, Beatrice. Their bodies leaned apart in the way of people who share space, but no longer warmth. Her gloved hands were folded tightly in her lap, His fingers toyed absently with the edge of a napkin. They were speaking, but not with words. The silence between them was not comfortable. It was resigned. Evelyn watched only for a moment, just long enough to feel nothing. Then Arthur turned. He saw her, and in that instant, his face changed, not with surprise, but with the soft agony of recognition. He began to rise, his hand resting on the edge of the table, his eyes lifting as if to speak. But Evelyn stood first and turned away. She left her tea untouched. The door closed behind her with a chime that did not follow her. The park awaited just across the square, its wrought-iron gates dusted with rust, the gravel paths still slick from the morning's rain. The trees remained bare, their limbs skeletal against the pewter sky, but beneath them, on a worn bench just beyond the fountain, Thomas Bellamy sat waiting. He had brought no flowers, no declarations, just a thermos and 2 tin cups. He saw her approaching and stood, not with flourish, but with that quiet reverence he always reserved for her, as though she were something rare, not to be startled. Evelyn slowed. Their eyes met. She said nothing, neither did he, not yet. He opened the thermos, the steam rising gently, swirling into the stillness between them. He poured without asking. 1 cup, then another, then handed hers with both hands, as though afraid it might spill more than tea. She accepted it. The warmth against her palms was grounding. They sat. The park was nearly empty. A nursemaid pushed a pram in the distance. A bird sang low in the hedgerow, its song tentative. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and the faintest trace of hyacinths blooming early. Evelyn took a sip. Thomas did not. His gaze remained fixed on the path ahead, on a world still learning how to turn without breaking. "I used to watch you," he said finally. His voice was low but steady. She turned her head slightly, not startled. "In the tea room," he continued, "long before we spoke, before I ever had the courage to sit beside you." She said nothing, allowing the silence to open gently. "You'd always arrive at the same time, sit in the same seat. That little ritual, the gloves, the way you tucked your hair behind your ear before reaching for your pencil." He stopped, almost embarrassed by the intimacy of the memory. "I thought you were sketching ghosts." Evelyn's lips parted, then curved, not in mockery but in understanding. "I was," she said softly. Thomas looked at her then, his hazel eyes full of storm and sunlight, of things lost and almost found. "I wasn't brave enough to interrupt," he admitted. "You looked complete, alone, but not lonely, like someone who had made peace with being forgotten." Evelyn studied him, her breath caught between history and hope. "You weren't wrong," she said. Then slowly she reached into her coat pocket and drew out a folded piece of paper. She passed it to him without ceremony. He opened it. A sketch of him, seated in the corner of Bellamy's tea room, his back to the window, notebook in hand, expression unreadable. Beneath it, in her own elegant handwriting, he waited too. Thomas blinked once, then twice, and when he looked at her again, his face was bare of pretense. They said nothing more. They did not need to. The tea cooled in their hands. The world continued, and for the first time, Evelyn did not feel the need to measure the moment. She was not waiting, she was here, and so was he. The season did not announce itself with fanfare. It arrived shyly, as if unsure of its welcome, through a tender warmth in the morning breeze, through the sudden appearance of crocuses bursting from between bricks along the garden walls. The air smelled different now, less like ash, more like beginnings. In Evelyn Hargrove's sitting room, the windows were open just wide enough to let in the scent of the thawed city. A vase of wild daffodils stood on the mantel, leaning gently toward the sun. The fire had not been lit in days. A package sat on the center table, wrapped in brown paper and bound in string. Evelyn untied it slowly, her fingers trembling not from uncertainty, but reverence. Inside lay her book, her first volume as sole illustrator, her name gilded on the cover beneath the title in delicate serif. Verses After the Silence, Langley House Publishing. Illustrations by Evelyn Hargrove. She ran her hand across the binding, then opened it to the first page. The paper smelled of ink and promise. The poems, 10 in all, lay nestled between her drawings, her strokes in charcoal and ink, delicate but unflinching. Some pages bore images of nature, wind-swept trees, fog-blurred rooftops, but others carried something more intimate. A man's hand resting over a notebook, the arc of a brow in half-light, a figure alone at a cafe table, head bowed, as if listening to the silence between memories. No names were mentioned, no identity declared, but any soul who had ever looked closely at another person and seen more than the surface would recognize him. Thomas. Her phone rang just once that morning. A congratulatory call from Langley himself, all bluster and praise. Reviews had begun to circulate. The Observer called her work haunting and honest. The Literary Times noted the aching humanity of her lines. Her illustrations were being called modern, feminine, resilient. She did not cry, not for success, not for recognition. But later, when she found Thomas's copy on the table by the window, open, his thumb resting between pages, as if caught mid-thought, she smiled. And that smile did not fade for hours. That afternoon, they took their walk, through Russell Square, past the university gates, past the cafe where she no longer sat waiting. They paused by the fountain. The bench where they had once shared tea beneath bare branches was now dusted with fallen petals. Evelyn reached into her coat pocket. "Your turn," she said gently. Thomas arched a brow. "My turn." She pressed a slim parcel into his hands. He opened it slowly, carefully, like a man afraid of revealing too much too quickly. It was a slim book, bound in soft blue linen. "Before the Words Returned" by Thomas Bellamy, he exhaled. Inside, poems, some short, others sprawling, filled the pages like quiet confessions. But what struck Evelyn most was not the verse or the language. It was the dedication. "To the woman who gave me my voice and never asked for it back." She closed the book without speaking. Thomas did not look at her. He looked at the square, at the sun breaking through the clouds above St. George's spire, and then at the blossom that had fallen on the path between them. "I almost didn't publish it," he said. "I know," she replied. "I wasn't sure if I was ready." "You were." He turned to her then, not with hunger, not with desperation, but with that gentle gravity she had come to know in him, the weight of someone who had once lost everything and now understood the fragility of every gift. They walked on. That evening, when they returned to the flat, Evelyn found a letter resting on the console table beneath the coat hooks. She frowned slightly, her name written in a hand that felt both distant and familiar. Charles Hargrove, her brother. She stared at it for a long moment. Thomas, behind her, said nothing. She sat on the edge of the settee, the envelope cool between her fingers. The paper was thick, the ink dark, the handwriting no longer stern. She did not open it. She rose, crossed the room, and slid the letter into the bottom drawer of her writing desk. Beneath old sketches, unused paper, and a single dried violet pressed between journal pages. Some things did not need to be resolved to be at peace. Later the rain came. Not in fury, but gently, drumming against the window panes like an old lullaby. The room glowed golden from the lamplight, casting shadows that no longer felt lonely. Evelyn set the kettle on. Thomas lit the fire. 2 cups were placed on the table. She poured without asking. He offered the sugar. Their fingers brushed, but neither withdrew. The intimacy was not in the gesture, but in its ease. They sat close, their legs touching lightly. The tea steeped between them, not as ritual, not as memory, but as presence. The sketchbook lay open nearby, the last drawing unfinished, a window, rain trailing across the glass, 2 teacups blurred in reflection. "I never thought I'd write again," Thomas murmured. "I never thought I'd stop waiting," Evelyn answered. They looked at each other then, and in that look was every promise neither had spoken aloud. The past had not vanished. It lived in the curve of her spine, in the quiet when they paused, in the poems and the sketches. But it no longer ruled. It simply remained. And as the tea cooled in their cups and the fire crackled low, Evelyn reached for his hand. He did not flinch. Outside, London breathed beneath the rain. Inside, there were no ghosts. Only two people, two voices, 2 cups of tea, and not a single thing left unsaid. The city had changed. Trams now clattered along the widened roads. Electric lamps replaced the old gaslights on Ridgemount Street, and women in cropped coats walked with a new kind of stride, head high, voices louder. The war was no longer spoken of daily, though it lingered in habits, in silences, in the way some windows still displayed framed medals above unused hearths. And yet, despite it all, some things had endured. At the edge of Hampstead Heath, nestled behind ivy-covered gates and a garden full of climbing roses, stood a modest brick cottage with pale blue shutters and a brass letterbox that bore the names E. Hargrove and T. Bellamy. The tea room was long gone, converted into a modern cafe with jazz spilling through its windows. But inside the cottage, the ritual remained. 2 cups. Always. One morning, Evelyn stood by the window, now 44, her hair touched gently with silver at the temples. She no longer pinned it so tightly. Her hands, though steadier than ever with a pencil, bore soft calluses from tending the garden each afternoon. On the kitchen table lay open correspondence, an invitation from the Royal Society of Artists to speak at a women's symposium. She had accepted, not for pride, for gratitude. She glanced toward the study door, left ajar. Inside, Thomas, now nearing 50, sat at his desk surrounded by loose pages and ink bottles. His back had curved slightly with the years, and his limp was more pronounced after a hard winter, but his eyes, those storm-soft, ink-bright eyes, had not lost their depth. He no longer hesitated when he wrote. Words came easily now, fluid, forgiving. On the wall above him hung a framed copy of his second poetry volume. Beneath the title, the same dedication, to the woman who gave me my voice and never asked for it back. They had not married. Not out of rebellion, but because they had found something stronger than ceremony, a kind of freedom bound by choice, not paper. Evelyn had taken his name for some legal matters, but never dropped her own. They had not had children, not for lack of love, but by quiet, mutual understanding. The world they shared was full enough, of pages, of sketches, of growing things. And sometimes, on Sunday afternoons, neighborhood children wandered into their garden for stories and biscuits. Evelyn kept a jar of lemon drops in the cupboard for them. Thomas pretended not to know where she hid them. One letter had come 3 years before, from Charles. She had opened it. It was brief, awkward, filled with too many apologies and not enough warmth. She never wrote back, but she had not thrown it away. In a carved wooden box beneath her desk, it sat beside the poem Thomas had left her during the storm. The ink had faded with time, but the words had not lost their ache. She returned to the present with the sound of a knock at the door. She opened it to find Beatrice, older, dressed in black, alone. Her hands, once so precise in gesture, now trembled. She had not written ahead. She had not asked permission. She simply came. Arthur had died the previous winter, a stroke, quick and merciless. Beatrice had been left not with grief, but with silence, an emptiness no pearls or poetry could fill. "I didn't come to ask for anything," she said, her voice rasped by time and loss, "only to tell you I remember." Evelyn did not offer her tea. She did not invite her inside, but she did not close the door. They stood in the threshold for some time, 2 women who had once loved the same man and paid 2 very different prices. Beatrice left with a nod. Evelyn returned to the garden, where Thomas waited with a thermos and 2 cups. They sat beneath the flowering apple tree, where petals fell like quiet blessings upon their shoulders. He handed her her tea. She looked at him. In his face was everything they had built, not in grand gestures or declarations, but in the 1,000 quiet ways they had chosen one another every day for 5 years. Evelyn lifted her cup. "To not waiting," she said softly. Thomas smiled. "To living." And as the wind rustled the branches above, as bees stirred lazily between blossoms, as the world moved steadily forward beyond the gate, They sipped their tea in silence, together, always. And so ends the story of Evelyn and Thomas, two souls who found one another not in the rush of passion, but in the quiet echo of survival, dignity, and second chances. This wasn't a love born from grand gestures or sweeping declarations. It was forged in silence, in tea shared without words, in glances held a second longer than expected. It's a reminder that love, true love, isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it waits, and sometimes it walks beside you, even when you think you're alone. Evelyn's journey teaches us that healing doesn't erase the past. It honors it, transforms it. That art can speak when we no longer have words. And that it's never too late to reclaim your voice, your joy, your place in the world. If this story moved you, if you too have ever waited for something or someone and found strength in the waiting, tell us in the comments what this tale meant to you. And if you made it to the end, write the word stillness in the comments. It will let us know you felt the depth, the beauty, the quiet triumph of this love. If you would like to support the small team behind this channel, the voices, the writers, the editors who pour their hearts into each story, you can leave a super thanks with any amount you wish. Every gesture helps us continue creating these emotional, timeless narratives that celebrate love in all its forms. And if you can't support financially, that's perfectly okay. You can still help by sharing this video with someone who might need a story like this today. A friend, a sister, a mother, someone who once loved and perhaps still waits. In the top corner, you'll find more stories that we think you'll love. Tales of resilience, longing, and unforgettable connections. Thank you for staying with us until the last line. Because sometimes, the quietest endings are the ones that echo the longest.